It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Catherine Malabou, who literally needs no introductions here, so I keep my lead-in very short. And I'll share then a little mimetic or hypermimetic experiment before handing it over to Catherine. Catherine Malabou is one of the most influential French philosophers writing today, whose work is known for its innovative and interdisciplinary approach. Her numerous books draw on a range of intellectual traditions, including German idealism, especially Hegel, deconstruction, neuroscience, and psychoanalysis, to explore questions about the nature of subjectivity, freedom, and transformation. Drawing on the concept of plasticity in particular, Malabou explores how Hegel's philosophy can be used to think about the ways in which subjectivity is formed and transformed over time. Plasticity, in fact, refers to the idea that the structure of the brain is not fixed, but can be shaped and reconfigured by experience and learning. Catherine Malabou's work has been influential not just in philosophy, but also in neuroscience and different areas of critical theory, including feminist theory. Her use of contemporary scientific research to illuminate philosophical questions is both bold and innovative, and her engagement with questions of addiction, trauma, mental illness, and more recently, feminine pleasure, AI simulations, and anarchy has made her work even more relevant for our contemporary world. Overall, Catherine Malabou's work is a testament to the power of interdisciplinary thinking, and her innovative use of philosophy and contemporary scientific research has opened up new venues for understanding the complex nature of subjectivity and transformation, including, if I may add a personal note, plastic transformations that find, perhaps in the new Metamorphoses of Mimesis, a motor scheme for the present and future, or l'avenir. Now, here's a question for you, Catherine. I felt the need to add this personal note at the end, and I was wondering if you could guess why.
You mean the new motor scheme?
Yes, the last sentence.
No.
Well, then I think that you failed the Turing test, because this introduction was totally computer generated, except for the last sentence. And I worried about it because I tried to read it well, but I felt that it wasn't good enough. And so I tried to give ChatGPT
a little bit of attitude.
A little bit of attitude and personality, but it indeed proves your point that AI simulation has reached such a point of sophistication where it becomes very difficult.
Very difficult.
Very difficult indeed. And
I saw that ChatGPT was passing the Turing test, by the way.
Indeed. So it's almost impossible to tell the difference, even though I must say I felt bad because it felt a little bit impersonal. So I gave it a bit of a tone. But I want to share, just as part of the introduction, the chat I had with ChatGPT. Okay. It's an OpenAI artificial intelligence programs that you interact with. And so I show you the dynamic that led to this introduction. I asked ChatGPT the following question. Did Derrida supervise women philosophers as well? And it was part of a longer discussion. I was testing the both. And can you give me some examples? And the answer was, yes, Jacques Derrida supervised and mentored several women philosophers during his career. Some examples include, and then it gives this list of people: Sarah Kaufman, Ellen Sixou, Gayatri Spivak, Judith Butler, specifying that she was influenced and did not study directly under Derrida. So kind of specific. But then I say, these are influential names, but you forgot an important woman philosopher who did her PhD on Hegel. And so the answer, very polite. I apologize on the other side. In my previous response, you're correct that there was an important woman philosopher who did her PhD on Hegel with Jacques Derrida, and that person is Drusilla Cornell, and then launches into a description of Cornell's work. Wow. So I continue then with the following. Yes, but I was thinking of someone even more influential. I apologize for the confusion. The person you may be referring to is likely the philosopher and gender theorist Lucy Irigaray, who came up quite often in the discussion. And I say, yes, but Irigaray did not write a PhD on Hegel.
That's great.
Since you're struggling, do you need a little help? Thank you for your patience. The reply is, not a problem. The philosopher I have in mind is French. Okay, and the answer is, thank you for the additional information. I'll apologize for any confusion earlier. It's possible that the French philosopher you're thinking is of Catherine Malabou. And she's a prominent philosopher who has written extensively on Hegel, and she also studied under Derrida, the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. I'm glad to have been able to help. Catherine Malabou is indeed an important, influential philosopher, and her work on Hegel and plasticity has made significant contribution to contemporary continental philosophy. So this was the starting point. Then, how would you introduce Malabou to an academic audience? I got the idea during that process. Could you write an eloquent and clear introduction to her important work? And the answer was, certainly, I can provide an introduction to Catherine Malabou's important work. And then it's the one that I'd give, so it was not so bad, apparently. And then I asked as a last question, do you think Malabou herself would be pleased with it? And Chatbot GPT reply, as an AI language model, I can't actually predict how Catherine Malabou herself would feel about a specific introduction to her work. However, I hope that my introduction and then will be sufficiently eloquent and so forth. And it continues. And I end by saying, by blowing the ChatGPT's mind, saying, I'll ask her. And that sounds like a great idea. If you have the opportunity to ask Catherine Malabou herself, it would be an excellent opportunity to gain insight into her own perspective on her work and her contribution to contemporary thought. I hope you have find the conversation enlightening and inspiring. And
that's incredible. Incredible.
It is amazing.
Wow, yes, really amazing. Thank you so much, Nidesh. This is the greatest introduction I ever had. I mean, it's wonderful.
I thought of making it fun. So
Yeah.
without further ado, it is my real pleasure to give the floor to Catherine Malabou. Her talk today is Mirroring and Conflicting Subliminalities. Catherine, the floor is entirely yours.
Well, first, of course, I want to express my utmost gratitude to you, Nidesh, and also to all the organizers for this incredible conference and all the speakers. And of course, you can imagine that my readers are really the people who give me confidence and courage to go on my path that can be sometimes very solitary. So it's a real gift, and thank you so much. So, in fact, what I want to defend in this paper is quite simple, which is that we all agree that mimesis cannot be restricted to its traditional meaning of imitation and reproduction of a model. Nevertheless, I would like to show that to acknowledge this divide between reproduction and creation is not enough to actually get rid of the traditional meaning. So this is what I would like to explain. In his great book, that is already a bit old, Homo Bhabha, the book is The Location of Culture. Homo Bhabha says that Western culture finds itself caught into and perhaps swept away in what he calls a moment of transit. He says that this moment of transit is all at once theoretical and political. And in this moment, he says, I quote, space and time cross to produce complex figures of difference and identity, like those of race, class, gender, mainly. So the new figures of difference and identity are no doubt embedded in specific forms of mimicry. But once again, they do not entail any vertical relationships between the original and its reproduction. The new mimetic dynamics operate horizontally and in the in-between spaces between identity and difference, between sex and gender, black and white, colonizer, colonized, or natural and artificial intelligence, thus producing hybrid resemblances, something that can be characterized, to quote Bhabha again, as something, yes, that can be characterized as almost the same, but not quite. There exists no sublation of those hybrid resemblances that would provide a synthesis or a unification. And Bhabha concludes on the need to currently consider mimesis in terms of borders, or what he calls liminalities. And the term liminality comes, of course, from the Latin limen, meaning threshold. So he says that mimesis is now liminal, which, because of the horizontality I just described, challenges profoundly the concept of model. But how does it challenge it? This is what I would like to explore. Because once again, I want to problematize the distinction between reproduction and creation. While I was reading Bhabha, it appeared to me that subliminality was even more perhaps helpful a determination. Subliminality is, of course, coined from the term subliminal, that is synonymous with subconscious, and designates a space that lies below the threshold of consciousness. Why this choice? Why the addition of that prefix sub to liminality? How helpful is it for exploring contemporaneous occurrences of mimesis? The purpose of the present talk is to answer these questions. Leaving Bhabha behind for now, and before returning to him in conclusion, I will first, in the first moment of the talk, I will give a definition of the subliminal and move toward the concept of subliminality, shedding light on the relationships I see at work between this concept and mimesis. In a second moment, I will precisely show that the opposition between reproduction and creation is not enough to get rid, as I said, of the traditional sense of mimesis. And in order to do so, I will confront white and black visions of subliminal mimesis. First, on the one hand, the French surrealist poet André Breton's conception of subliminal imitation. And second, Frantz Fanon's, along with Sylvia Wynter and the Yoruba African writer Amos Tutuola, in order to see how they understand the phenomenon of subliminal mimesis in a different way. And in conclusion, I will attempt at bringing to light the political stakes of this confrontation, arguing that surrealist subliminalities, however dismissive of the reproductive understanding of mimesis, are still trapped within it. So I see my present paper as a moment of transit between two conceptions of non-reproductive mimesis. Okay, so I start with a few definitions of the terms subliminal and subliminality. As I just said, subliminal is synonymous with subconscious, and the two words, subliminal and subconscious, are frequently used interchangeably, and they both are important terms in psychology. As previously mentioned, they literally mean below the threshold, and in that case, below the threshold of consciousness, designating the regions of the psyche or the brain where images, thoughts, impressions are formed prior becoming conscious. So the terms subconscious and subliminal come from two main sources. The first one is the French psychologist Pierre Janet's work. We were talking about him yesterday with Nidesh. Janet's main book is called Psychological Automatism, and it's a book from 1889. Janet defines the subconscious as the locus of what he calls, I quote, the inferior forms of human activity. These inferior forms comprise all automatic mental behaviors like reflexes, routines, but also hysteria, sleepwalking, and other strange phenomena like that. He says, in our minds, there are two main forms of activities: automatisms, subconscious, and synthesis, consciousness. automatism corresponds with the primal and archaic zones of the psyche, and the latter, synthesis, to the higher levels of intellectual activities. On the basis of experimental work with hysterics, Janet demonstrated that in morbid states, due to a diminished field of consciousness, automatism took precedence over the activity of synthesis. So this was the first source. The second source is the theory of the subliminal self, elaborated by the British all-at-once poet, philologist, and psychologist Friedrich Myers, who was the cousin of William James. And James has written a lot about his cousin work. The theory of the subliminal self is developed mainly in Myers' book called Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death in 2 volumes. It's Human Personality and Its Survival, of Bodily Death, 2 volumes from 1903. Myers' main preoccupation is whether the dead can be considered to speak in us, through us. And he rigorously explores phenomena that go beyond the vigilant consciousness, such as telepathy, transmission of thoughts, visions of the future or the past, and out-of-body exit. He argues that all these phenomena, which make the success of magnetizers, deserve to become objects of rigorous scientific study. That's why a new scientific field appears with Myers that is called metapsychics. And this new field takes a new look at the paranormal. And survival, the question of survival, is central to Myers' work. Once again, to what extent can the spirit be said to survive the disappearance of the body? There is a strong link between the 2 sources, between the subliminal understood as automatism, like in Janet, and the subliminal understood as the psychic reservation of ghosts, as in Myers' work. If we just have a look at the table of content of Janet's book, Psychological Automatisms, we find many references to ghosts. I'd quote a few of them: the divinatory wand, the pendulum, the reading of thoughts, spiritualism, spiritism and psychological disintegration, comparison of mediums and somnambulists, etc., etc. So let's keep in mind the interaction between these 2 sources, first the automatisms, and second the ghosts, as they will prove essential to our problem, which again is the link between reproductive and non-reproductive mimesis. So you might ask yourself, but where is she going? What is the link between these sources and the problem? So here is the link. As I was reading these different psychological and neurological accounts of the subliminal, it suddenly occurred to me that the subliminal was perhaps nothing else but the biological and psychological site for mimesis. That the subliminal is perhaps the bodily inscription of mimesis. And even more, it is perhaps the biological and bodily site of the coexistence between the 2 kinds of mimesis, the reproductive one that functions on the model copy structure, and the horizontal, hybrid, or liminal one, in one word, the creative one. So once again, maybe the subliminal is the site, the biological site for mimesis in its double sense, reproductive and creative. First, reproductive. If we follow the aforementioned definitions by Janet or Myers, we see that the subliminal or the subconscious appear as the most influenceable part of the psyche. Janet calls it its suggestible part. The subliminal is the psychological and neurological site of imitation. Let's think of the so-called subliminal techniques used by public media in advertisement of all sorts or political propaganda. These techniques aim at manipulating attitudes and behaviors in such a way that individuals are unaware of the source of influence or even the fact that they are being influenced. So we've all heard about these subliminal techniques, like embedded messages in a song, words and images briefly flashing in between frames of film, usually at 1/10 of a second, drawings or photos that contain hidden or subtle images, etc. The way a subliminal message works is to imprint a content into the reader's or viewer's mind without it being immediately noticeable. So we have several examples of that. I think of John Carpenter's film, They Live. It's a very interesting film from 1988. Or I was rereading a book about The Exorcist, you know, the film, that contains many subliminal images of the devil. So what is important for our topic here is that behind this name subliminal, psychologists try to prove that there existed a part of the brain and the psyche ready to form automatisms out of influence. Once imprinted, the images, the words, automatically recur in our mind and determine repetitive behaviors using the mimetic logic of habit. At the same time, the subliminal appears as a creative form, not only reproductive, but also creative, and is the birthplace of an inventive, creative kind of mimesis, able to create originals. The creative potential of the subliminal has been powerfully brought to light at a certain moment in the history of literature, that is surrealism. We know that poets like André Breton in particular were very clear that the source for poetic inspiration was never conscious, but always subconscious, subliminal. And Breton has a book called Surrealism and Painting, in which he contrasts between what he calls imitation of an external model and imitation of an internal model. And poetry is imitation of a subliminal internal model. I read from Surrealism and Painting. The very narrow conception of imitation, which art has been given as its aim, is at the bottom of a serious misunderstanding that we see continuing right up to the present. In the belief that they are only capable of reproducing more or less fortunately the image of that which moves them, painters have been far too easygoing in their choice of models. The mistake lies in thinking that the model can only be taken from the exterior world, or even simply that it can be taken at all. There lies the inexcusable abdication. It is in any case impossible under the present conditions of thought, when above all the exterior world appears more and more suspect, still to consent to such a sacrifice. The plastic work of art, in order to respond to the undisputed necessity of thoroughly revising all real values, will either refer to a purely interior model or cease to exist. So will either refer to a purely interior model or cease to exist. And he adds, Breton, it remains to us to determine what is meant by the term interior model. And this is where he says that this interior model cannot be conscious, that it is necessarily subliminal. This is what he explains in the famous Manifesto of Surrealism from 1924, where, and we find Janet again, where he equates poetry, in particular surrealism, with automatism, defining the word surrealism as, I quote, psychic automatism in its pure state, based on the actual function in thought, in the absence of any control exercised by reason or consciousness. This is an assertion that he confirms 9 years later in another text, very famous other text called The Automatic Message from 1933, where he affirms that mediumism and surrealism might actually be very similar. So you know it's about the image of the seer. The poet is like a seer who sees inside of their subconscious this famous model that they have to recreate. And so the comparison between the poet and the medium is also very frequent in Breton. But how is it possible to differentiate the two kinds of mimesis, reproductive and creative? When we speak of a model, even if interior, how will we differentiate between reproduction and creation, between what would be a pure repetitive automatism, like the one I was talking about in the subliminal message, and an automatism that is paradoxically, poetically creative? How can an automatism be creative? And this is the main question of surrealism. He says, okay, Breton explains that we have to understand what a medium is. Most of the time, mediums and a great majority of people who say they keep hearing voices or seeing ghosts believe that the voices that they hear or the images that they see come from outside, are sent to us from other people, from beyond the grave, or even from other planets. It is vital for Breton to understand that the ghosts, the voices that we hear, or the images that we see, are, perhaps we have the feeling that they come from outside, but in reality, they come from us, hence the notion of internal models. They are first present in our subconscious, not as real persons, but as signs, letters, ciphers that need to be interpreted, that is, in reality, created. So the metaphor of the poet as a medium means that the medium is, first of all, internal. So suggestion is also very important in automatic writing practices. And there's an obvious relationship between automatism and haunting. However, and once again, the model is interior, which means that the ghost is the outside of the inside, as Deleuze or Derrida would say, le dehors du dedans. And it is the task of poetry to make them speak. So we are touching here on the plasticity of subliminal mimesis, because the two mimetic trends, reproductive and creative, operate in the same site, the subliminal being both the site of influence, suggestion, and the site of creation, almost the same, but not quite, as Bhabha would say. They are almost the same, but they remain radically different. The subconscious and the subliminal have been undervalued and dismissed by psychoanalysis, and they have disappeared as major concepts for a long time. And if I got interested in these notions recently, it is because I discovered that these notions were in a certain sense reborn from the most recent research in neurology. Inside the brain, the subconscious is located in a region called the basal ganglia, a set of subcortical nuclei. Basal ganglia are not only involved in motor automaticity, but also in the functioning of intellectual and affective faculties. I just quote one French neurologist, Lionel Nakache, who declares, "We define subliminal processing, etymologically below the threshold as a condition of information, inaccessibility, where bottom-up activation is insufficient to trigger a large-scale reverberating state in a global network of neurons with long-range accents. Note that, under our hypothesis, subliminal processing is not confined to a passive spreading of activation, independent of the subject's attention and strategies. On the contrary, it can orient and amplify the processing of a conscious stimulus, even if its bottom-up strength remains insufficient for global ignition. I'm sorry for this very barbaric phrase. Well, in clear language, it means that the subliminal is not only passive, but that it can initiate a creative conscious dynamism. So all these nuclei that determine the primary mental activities are not only precisely passive, but they can determine the highest form of intellectual activity. And this brings me back to poetry, but this time from the point of view of mathematics. I found a fascinating text by the French mathematician Henri Poincaré, where he talks about mathematical creation. And he explains that, in fact, in the mathematician's brain, mathematical creation comes just automatically. It's a sudden explosion. So I read from Poincaré. What happens then in the mathematical creation? Among the great numbers of combinations blindly formed by the subliminal self, almost all are without interest and without utility. But just for that reason, they are also without effect upon the aesthetic sensibility. Consciousness will never know them. Only certain ones are harmonious and consequently at once useful and beautiful. They will be capable of touching the special sensibility of the geometer of which I have just spoken, and which, once aroused, will call our attention to them and thus give them occasion to become conscious. When a sudden illumination seizes upon the mind of the mathematician, it usually happens that it does not deceive him. It always gratifies the natural feeling for mathematical elegance. So this is from Henri Poincaré, Mathematical Creation, in this extraordinary text, complicated here also, but what he means is that the mathematical creations that will endure will be the one that will be the most beautiful, that is the most poetic among the series of all possible hypotheses. The ones that will be victorious, that will triumph, so to speak, will always be the ones that are the most poetic, which once again confirm the idea that at the level of the subconscious, there's this alliance between automatism and beauty, automatism and poetry. I could have stopped here, but once again showing, well, if we examine the subliminal, or if we follow this notion of the subconscious, which is very rich, I can only here give a few hints. I mean, but if we had time, we would see that this is an immense topic. I could have just shown, you see, okay, we are right. There are two kinds of mimesis, reproductive and creative. And if we examine the subconscious, we have the proof that such is the case. Once again, I want to demonstrate, and this is my second part, that to oppose or to, yes, to show that there's always something creative balancing the reproductive is not enough to really get rid of the reproductive model. Isn't it the case that poetic invention or mathematical invention as defined by Breton or Poincaré, have become in turn genuine models imposing themselves as universal upon non-Western minds, thus dispossessing them of their own ghosts. There is subliminal and subliminal, subconscious and subconscious, mimesis and mimesis, ghosts and ghosts, internal models and internal models. But all these doubling are redoubled again when we look at non-Western forms of subliminalities. In a very interesting article, Sylvia Wynter, the Jamaican thinker and writer, tries to explain what Frantz Fanon announces as the necessity to create a science called sociogeny in black skin and white masks. Fanon says, I quote, "Beside phylogeny and ontogeny stands sociogeny." And we know that he announces this new science, the necessity of this new science, against psychoanalysis and psychology. Wynter's article is called "Towards the Sociogenic Principle, Fanon, the Puzzle of Conscious Experience, of Identity, and What It's Like to be Black." And she affirms that sociogeny, in opposition to Western psychoanalysis and psychology, relies on a split between black and white subliminalities that cannot be identified. She interprets this split between two forms of subliminalities, black and white. She identifies this split as what W.B. Du Bois in The Soul of Black Folks calls the phenomenon of double consciousness. So I'm sure you all know, you've all heard about double consciousness. Du Bois calls double consciousness the fracture that exists between the Black person's two selves, one that identifies with the normative white self, and the other who knows itself as dominated. And the subliminal, for Wynter, who reinterprets the double consciousness, the subliminal, the Black subliminal, is the neural site where the fragmentation of the self, due to the contradiction with that dominant position, is inscribed and elaborated. Wynter reinterprets double consciousness by referring consistently to neurobiology. She declares Fanon's sociogenic conception of the human, one generated from the ground of his own, as well as that of his fellow French Caribbean subjects' lived experience of being Black, of what it is to be Black, also opens a frontier onto the solution to the problem defined by David Chalmers as that of the puzzle of conscious experience. For Wynter, the puzzle of conscious experience once again pertains to the subliminal split that sustains Black consciousness. So what is now this subliminal split that is very different from the white subliminal? The economy brought to light by André Breton between reproductive and creative mimesis finds itself redoubled here when it comes to the Black subliminal space. When Du Bois declares that Black consciousness is a mimic of the white one, that it is in a certain sense its subliminal message, he means that this mimic is in reality a mimic of a mimic, or even a mimic of two mimics. The Black has to interiorize the way in which white subconsciousness is reproductive, mimic one, but it also have to interiorize the way in which white subconsciousness is creative. The Black subconscious has to imitate and mimically recreate the way in which the white subconscious imitates and creates. let's think of all Black artists who've been led to invent works that remained assimilable by white culture. So in a certain sense, the Black creative mimesis has most of the time been just an imitation of white creation. So we see here how the problem redoubles. There exists a Black mimetic version of white reproduction and the Black mimetic version of white creation. And in that sense, it appears that double consciousness is multi-layered, exceeding the form of the dyad. It shelters a series of chiasmatic subliminalities, which forbids us to just divide between creation and reproduction, because now we have to take into account, as you understand, imitation of creation, imitation of reproduction, etc., etc., etc. What about Black mimesis then? This time, Black specific reproductive mimesis and Black specific creative mimesis. The part of double consciousness, which is, I would say, specifically Black. Both Black reproductive mimesis and Black creative mimesis both pertain to the voices of the ancestors. But these ancestors can be called ghosts, but these ghosts will never be assimilated with the white ones. Because in that case, the ancestral voices are, of course, requesting to be repeated, transmitted through generations, but at the same time, these voices have been forever erased and must be recreated out of nothing. In that case, the model is not even interior, it is absent, born dead from dispossession. So creation here is not even the imitation of an interior model, it's an imitation of an absent model. It is on this mimetic creation without any model, in exterior or interior, that I wish to end. In a beautiful book devoted to the difficult problem of the translation of African languages, this is a French book called Le Sable de Babel, The Sand of Babel, by the French anthropologist Alain Ricard. So in that book, Ricard comments on the fact that many African writers don't write, as we know, in their mother tongues, but in European languages, mostly English or French. And for Ricard, it is a case of what he calls subliminal translation. A subliminal translation, he explains, is the restitution by the writer of an original text written in an African language, like Yoruba, for example, in a European or foreign language, except that there is no original text. The writer translates themselves from their native tongue into the colonizing one, except that the native tongue is not a written one. The subliminal translation, I quote from Ricard, the subliminal translation does not operate from a text in one language to a text in another language, but from one language to another in the same text. Such texts are palimpsests because under the scriptural authority of the target European text, the obliterated vestiges of the African source are still supposedly visible. Obscure translations are read as translations, but there are no originals. They mimic an original language, which the author does not or no longer speak. I consider this practice to be an original variety of translation, subliminal translation, that which has difficulty reaching consciousness. So I would say that we can understand this absence of model when we think precisely of a mother tongue that African writers have never really learned, that most of the time they don't even know, and at the same time that persist in them in its very absence, in their very absence. And that's why I said I would talk just a little bit about this Nigerian writer, Amos Tutuola. He wrote The Palm Wine Drinker, My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, Simbi and the Satyr of the Dark Jungle. He's fascinating because he's considered the founder of English-speaking Nigerian novel. And what is fascinating is that he says, I'm translating from Yoruba. So his English is very imperfect, very close to oral colloquial language, but at the same time, he doesn't know a word of Yoruba. So he invents, in a certain sense, a Yoruban English from an absent original text. So we can say that his Yoruba is a poetic construction. I quote Ricard again. Tutuola's texts are translated from a subliminal Yoruba. And he goes on, in his own way, when the first book appeared, and let us remember that it was in 1952, the first Nigerian and English novel, Yoruba was, Tutuola was considered a traitor. He did not translate tales, but invented them, furthermore in English. This first novelist, who ignores grammar, dishonors his country, humiliates the Nigerian intelligentsia, and it will take some time for him to be rid of his stigmata. In the colonial world, only those who have the money and the authorizations publish locally. Those who appeal to Paris or London for their linguistic mastery are recognized as writers. There's no literary field in the colony. So here, Ricard, as you understand, says that when Tutuola published his first book, people were scandalized by saying, what is this bad English, etc., etc. But of course, Tutuola's subliminal translations not only survived, but were in their turn translated into several languages, and he's considered, of course, now as one of the greatest African writers. So this was just an example of what I meant by by a kind of non-reproductive kind of mimesis that, in my view, has nothing to do with the non-reproductive kind of mimesis that Breton is talking about. So now I come to my conclusion. And in this conclusion, I will tell you the very reason why I'm interested in the subliminal. Where are we at the end of this journey that took us from the inner model of the surrealists to the absence of model for colonized thinkers and writers? Such a journey has retraced a trajectory that symbolizes, in my view, one of the most important political and artistic paradigm shift of our time, the shift from the sublime to the subliminal. And this was my goal, to insist in the end of this paradigm shift from the sublime to the subliminal. Both words are, of course, very similar. The word sublime is often understood as above the threshold, but also below the threshold. But their use, subliminal and sublime, and their political consequences are dramatically different. As we know, the sublime became, at the end of the 20th century, this is a phenomenon that started around the 80s, it became a major artistic and political category. Taken from Kant's aesthetics and powerfully reinterpreted by Jean-François Lyotard, it was understood as the unpresentable character of political traumas, the Shoah in particular. So, to be brief, Lyotard interprets Kant's aesthetics and the partition between the beautiful and the sublime as the partition between imitation in the sense of reproduction. The beautiful will always be an imitation of nature, and the sublime, which exceeds all forms of imitation. And Lyotard says that in a certain sense, the sublime is comparable to the creation of an absent mother tongue. And once again, it says that the sublime can be reinterpreted today as a way to present, without really being able to present it, the fundamental, the most important shocks, traumas, dispossessions, etc., of our times. But I don't agree with that, because I think that the great displacement Bhabha is talking about, the great transit in which we are caught, it provokes a gradual distancing from the sublime. If we look at the surrealist, once again, I think that surrealism still belongs in the time of the sublime. And in L'Amour Fou, for example, Breton talks about the sublime point from which he creates. He says, I situate my sublime point in the mountain. But the sublime in Kant is said to be creative because it is said to open to freedom. The beautiful is always attached to a form. In that sense, it is always constricted, constrained, rather than the sublime is, of course, born from shock, trauma, etc., but at the same time, it opens a kind of immense perspective on absolute freedom. And I think that the sublime identifies creative mimesis with freedom. And this is this equation between creation and freedom that I want to challenge in the end with the subliminal. The subliminal, on the contrary, and I took the example of subliminal translation, is a mimesis of a loss, as I said, missing narrative of dispossession, colonization, and slavery. Of course, it is creative. I took the example of Tutuola's books. Of course, they are creative, but the difference is that subliminal creations, in the sense of Tutuola's or subliminal translations, never end up in something like freedom. In Lyotard's view, the sublime is a disruptive event that challenges authoritative and institutionalized modes of power and authority. Subliminal translation, for its part, calls into question this very ideal of suspension of authority. It calls into question the idea that creation is always free. Subliminal translation is never done with power. It sits in its gaps, it plays with it, but it is constantly threatened to be crushed by it. Decolonial mimesis is contemporaneous with its repression. Therefore, and once again, its poetic work has nothing to do with the work of freedom. Today's great cultural and political shift, the great transit that Bhabha is talking about, coincides with the movement of a subliminal that does not sublimate oppression. And these will be my last words about mimesis, or of what it has become. I would define mimesis today as a subliminal force without any sublimating power. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for this wonderful, wonderful concluding keynote that brings together so many strings and echoes of the discussion we have had over these 2 days, but also opening up perspectives that are totally original and new, adding a political dimension as well, and a decolonial perspective to the problematic of what was often called the unconscious. But you're absolutely right that going back to figures like Janet and their theory of the subconscious, which has been very, very central to the Homo Mimeticus project, provides totally new connections that are central to what we started calling the mimetic turn, or a return to a mimesis that is creative and affirmative without being necessarily caught in notion of genial freedom or originality. Catherine, we use the trope of the mirror quite often for our dialogue, and you have it in your title. And I'm amazed by the mirroring continuities that emerged during your keynote. I didn't know you would go to Janet, but I hesitated at some point whether I could give a talk or not, and I decided not to. But Janet would have been
too bad.
No, it's good. It's good to let other people come in, because mimetic studies need pluralistic perspectives. But Janet played a major role for my understanding of what I ended up calling the mimetic unconscious, simply to call attention via Janet notion of the subconscious, that there is an unconscious before Freud, and because the unconscious is a more dominant, or let's say a widespread concept, I thought I retained the unconscious, even though my starting point was Pierre Janet, and specifically his interest in suggestion that you also pointed to, the fascination with hypnosis and suggestion before Freud, that introduces a relational dimension as well. And on the decolonial front, I was very happy that you went to Bhabha, his notion of mimicry, which I think resonates quite a bit with Irigaray in certain sense. There is a destabilizing property or improperty in being almost the same, but not quite. That sets up a destabilizing mirror to the dominant. And so I was wondering if we add gender to the perspective, because we have race, and Du Bois, by the way, has also been one of my favorite, the question of double consciousness as a mixed subject traveling across countries, France, England, the States. The problematic of racism always confronted me with the problematic of double consciousness, because each country construes the other very different. So this veil that Du Bois speaks about, of seeing the world through a veil, is something that really prompted my interest in mimesis. It's always in this kind of dialectic, if you want, with the outside, that a certain productivity emerges, not only a passive impression of the dominant model, but also a productive notion of mimesis. So these are all connections that are absolutely fantastic and central to mimetic studies. And I was wondering if you could add something about gender. How does problematic of gender add to the subliminal perspective that you were discussing via the example of African literature?
It is true that I haven't thought of that for this talk, but the more I think about all these things, and the more I advance on my path, the more I feel, even if I'm white, I feel like it is impossible to come to terms with power and domination, and that freedom seems to be a less and less helpful concept. And for a long time, I thought that there might be a gender construction, a gender creative mimesis that was emancipatory. And I identified myself as a free woman in the sense of someone who had been able to be aware of oppression, to someone who had been lucky enough to have tools of emancipation, critical tools, etc., and that there might, I believe that there existed ways of gender constructions that were really emancipatory, even if, of course, oppression was always present. Now, I don't think that it is the case. When I see the violence against women. I mean, when I think of that, and when I think of the backlash that feminism is encountering every day, it seems to me that, in fact, my gender consciousness is closer and closer to the Black one I was talking about than the sublime one. I think that I was perhaps too quick in thinking that I could sublimate gender oppression through a creative construction of my gender, you see. So I would assimilate gender with a colonized mind, you know. Well, I would need time to develop, but this would be my immediate answer.
Yes, indeed, and joining the two perspectives would be very productive. There is this quote by Zora Neale Hurston that the African American woman is the mule of the world, where the problematic is doubled by race and oppression. So thank you for that. Marina has a question. Marina, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Professor Malabou, for this very inspiring talk. And I wanted to follow on Nidesh's question on how could we apply lessons from your talk to the gender mimesis perspective, and your answer specifically on how now, looking back, you tend to, let's say, identify more with the answer of Black consciousness. But and I wanted to recall that, I mean, obviously feminism of sexual difference has been important in your itinerary. And what are the difference, what are the things, these ideas that you find now interesting in Black consciousness compared to that? Because to me, feminism of sexual difference means being a woman-identified woman, not a woman identified with men, with the ideas that men have created on us, with as you know very well, with the clitorian woman by Carla, and to start from oneself to love women instead of men. And that's a very mimetic response, because it's about identification with women. It's about creating feminine genealogies with women, and not only feminist, loving the mother and the grandmother. And so why wouldn't this tradition not bring the solution, but at least some elements to this specific problem as well? That was my question.
Because the very notion of woman, I see what you mean, this kind of feminine culture, let's say, is very controversial, even among women themselves, and among also transgender people. And as you know, there's a transfeminism at the moment that profoundly challenges the very concept of femininity or the woman. So, I mean, unfortunately, feminism in all its forms today is a war front. You know that. Huh? So there's no good solution. There are spaces that we can inhabit. There are things we can do, but there is no, at the moment, I don't see any peace coming from anywhere. Transfeminism attacks the feminism of sexual difference. The feminism of sexual difference becomes something like a reservation of turfs, etc., etc., etc. We have to decline our pronouns. So I don't see any. I mean, it's very good that this is a field of differences. This is very good, but these differences are conflictual, and sometimes very violently conflictual. So I find that very unfortunate, and I understand what you say, but I don't see it as a let's say a solution. You see?
Thank you.
There is a comment from Amanda that I read. Where do the international representation come from? You mentioned the subconscious, ghosts, and ESP. Can you elaborate? Is this related?
What is ESP?
Exactly. So maybe, Amanda, you can clarify.
Oh, I thought you did say ESP, external sensory perceptuary.
Out of body, is that? Okay.
Right, where there's a few different forms of it. Basically, you can feel someone else's thoughts.
Yeah.
You can sometimes have clairvoyance and predict the future. Some people have the ability to. Turing actually breaks it down and really believes in it, was the thing that, but then it's been completely debunked. In terms
No,
of,
you're right. It's just that I didn't know these initials, but I see what you mean. Okay, so can you elaborate? Is this related to the Plato and Meno? And how will you inquire, Socrates, into what you know not? What will you put forth as a subject of inquiry? And if you find what you want, how will you ever know that this is what you didn't know? To deal with this puzzle, Plato invented this famous theory of recollection. Is it related? Also, it may relate that Turing believed in ghosts and ESP in 1950, which had science at the time to back it up. Okay, interesting about Turing, but about Plato, as you remember that this theory of anamnesis, of remembrance, is developed by Socrates out of the how to say that? My English, let's say interview of a slave. You remember that? Huh? Plato says, we don't forget anything. Let's interrogate this young slave. I'm sure he, because it's a he, remembers the theory of the square, etc. And he asks questions to the slave, and the little boy answers. And Plato says, see, he perfectly remembers. So to know is to remember. And when I was a student, teachers presented that myth of remembrance of things we haven't lived, of things we haven't learned, but that are inscribed in our memories by the virtue of ideas. And they presented that as something totally normal without ever commenting on the fact that the boy was a slave. And so there was no mention at any moment of what this boy was actually feeling, what kind of mind he had, and how he reacted to that interview itself. So what I tried to present with my African examples was totally different from Plato's theory of remembrance.
Thank you for the clarification, Catherine. And indeed, this tension between a Greek determination of mimesis that I inherited via figures like Nietzsche and more recently the Coulabart and the Derridian tradition that is also internal to your genealogy, I think benefits from being supplemented from other traditions and perspectives. And when you were talking about the medium, the poet as a medium, indeed there is the romantic tradition that links it to the figure of the genius, but also I've been working on African novels like by Chinua Achebe, who is very similar situation, just writing in English instead of Igbo. Things fall apart, and where the writer takes on a collective voice. To go back to Mark's point, the narrator as a communal collective perspective that is not the one of an individual, but is one who is in touch with the ancestors, or at least mediating ancestors that are no longer present, but are convoked as phantoms of sort, and generate a physical presence in the during rituals that are mimetic in that sense, that generate what Durkheim would call an effervescence. So yes, I found it interesting. The medium can be tied to the Pythia, to the Greek tradition as well, to Ion being enthusiastic and divinely possessed by the muses, but also to a more immanent, or let's say a communal perspective that is internal to an African tradition, for instance. So thank you for bringing in anthropology as well, because that is an important perspective. So thank you very much. We have reached the end, perfect timing, 5:01.
Thank you so much, Nidesh. It was great, really, in the 2 days. Yeah, wonderful.